Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday, the 23rd of July here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, Kamala Harris secures enough pledged delegates to clinch the Democratic presidential nomination. Attention turns to who the vice presidential pick could be, with swing state politicians in focus. Plus, global implications. World leaders rush to size up Harris whilst preparing for a Trump win. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Kamala Harris now has more than enough pledged delegates to clinch the Democratic presidential nomination. In a statement, she said she was proud to have secured the broad support needed to become our party's nominee. The news follows an extraordinary two-day blitz that saw the vice president consolidate her party's backing to challenge Donald Trump in November. And speaking just hours ahead of securing the nomination, Harris sought to offer a message of unity.
So in the days and weeks ahead, I, together with you, will do everything in my power to unite our Democratic Party, to unite our nation, and to win this election.
And those comments from the Vice President and now presumptive Democratic nominee were echoed by Joe Biden, who called into the Harris event in Delaware.
The name has changed at the top of the ticket, but the mission hasn't changed at all. And by the way, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be out there in the campaign with her, with Kamala. I'm going to be working like hell, both as a sitting president, getting legislation passed, as well as in campaigning.
President Biden speaking publicly there for the first time since he announced his decision to exit the race on Sunday. Delegates will formalise their votes in the coming weeks, with party leaders outlining a virtual balloting process to officially designate a nominee by the 7th of August. Harris will now recommend a running mate to delegates ahead of the party's national convention in Chicago in a few weeks' time. Larry Sabato, who's director of the Center of Politics at the University of Virginia, lays out her options.
I'm old-fashioned. I think that you want to have a balanced ticket. So you pick somebody who's not like you, but can appeal to other segments of the party and the population. And this is all about electoral votes. You know, you can talk about anything you want to, but you win when you get 270 electoral votes. So you pick somebody who can win electoral votes. To me, that means Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, that's 19 electoral votes, or Governor Cooper of North Carolina, that's 16 electoral votes, or Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, that's 11 electoral votes, plus he's already known because of his astronaut career.
Larry Sabato speaking there to Bloomberg's Balance of Power. Harris will hold her debut public rally as a presidential candidate later today in the battleground state of Wisconsin. A recent CBS News YouGov poll showed Harris performing better than Biden, but still trailing Trump nationally. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's account on Truth Social has put out a series of posts accusing Harris of being a liar and saying, quote, "Be careful what you wish for, Democrats." Well, with Joe Biden now out of the race, attention is turning to Kamala Harris as allies and foes alike examine what a Harris campaign or even a Harris White House might mean. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
Most European governments are quietly cultivating relations with Republicans, anticipating a Trump return. But some are starting to turn their attention to Kamala Harris. Top of the agenda is foreign policy. Heads of state are assessing how Harris's approach to geopolitical challenges might differ to Biden's. For Poland, her stance on NATO is the priority, according to the country's interior minister, while Serbian leader Alexander Vučić advised the vice president to persuade Michelle Obama to join her campaign. Further afield in Asia, Bloomberg understands officials in Tokyo are optimistic that a President Harris would cement ties with Japan. But while polls suggest Harris may be marginally better placed to challenge Trump, that doesn't alter the basic calculation for governments around the world. They need to be ready for a second Trump term. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
The EU's foreign policy chiefs plan to move meetings of the bloc's foreign and defence ministers to Brussels from Budapest. It's a protest against Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's diplomatic undertakings. Meetings are traditionally convened by the country holding the EU's rotating presidency, but member states have been angered by the leaders' visits to Moscow, Beijing and to see Donald Trump in Florida. Despite the criticism, Orbán says that he will continue his self-styled peace mission. And in other news, economists say that the Bank of England may soon put an end to Labour's honeymoon in the UK. The central bank is expected to remind the new government that the UK economy is likely to barely grow in the long run. Bloomberg senior economy reporter Phil Aldrich has been talking to analysts about Britain's prospects. He says he thinks Prime Minister Keir Starmer probably regrets mentioning a desire to see 2.5% growth for the UK.
I suspect that Keir Starmer regrets getting pinned down. He was pressed and pressed in his interview. You know, the Bank of England has its estimate of our sort of growth potential at little more than 1%. So for us to be achieving sort of 2.5% regularly, that would be a step change.
Bloomberg's Phil Aldrich. His story comes ahead of the central bank's economic forecast that comes next week. If the new government can't meet its growth targets, it will be forced to either shrink the size of the state or raise taxes. So that on the UK. In terms of corporate news, Porsche has cut its full-year revenue forecast, saying that a shortage of aluminium parts from a key supplier could force it to stop production of some models. The car maker expects a revenue of up to $43 billion. That is down from its previous forecast of as much as $45 billion. On Monday, Porsche dropped its targets also for EVs to make up 80% of sales by 2030, citing cooling demand and China's slowdown. Let's get back, though, to our top story. Kamala Harris has enough support from delegates to clinch the Democratic presidential nomination. She has quickly sewn up support from major Democrats and has access to Biden's $96 million war chest for her campaign. In a speech to her campaign staff in Wilmington in Delaware, she said that she knows Donald Trump's type. Joining us now to discuss, Europe Executive Editor Chad Thomas and Bloomberg's EMEA News Editor Roslyn Matheson. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being back with me this morning. We were having conversations yesterday. Good to speak to you again now that we have more details from Kamala Harris. She says that she will unite her party. She seems to have no opposition now. Looking at, for example, the reaction in the US, the Washington Post op-ed arguing that Democrats are coalescing too quickly around Harris, saying that a contested nomination might be better for the party and for the country. Ros Matheson, what do you make of that and that message that we got yesterday from Harris at her campaign HQ?
Well, certainly she came out to say that she intends to campaign to win, and she's done a 2-day very aggressive push working the phones. This has been pretty quick to get to that threshold of pledged delegates, and also the donor enthusiasm that you talked about, more than 80 million raised just in the last few days alone. But there is that kind of that message still coming in the Washington Post in a few quarters in the Democrats that an open contest might draw out more talent from the pool and counter that narrative that this is a coronation and rather than being a contest for the nomination, because usually it's a contest, at least for the party that doesn't hold the presidency. And the Democrats have fallen afoul of that narrative, you know, for years of lacking a deep bench of younger people, of senior figures who are quite elderly. I mean, look at the former Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, who stayed around for decades. But clearly the calculation here is that the priority is time, and it's going to be a challenge to rev up a new presidential campaign with only months to go. So, and, you know, more problematic if they're bickering and jostling with each other. But what might be interesting is the contest for a vice president candidate. That could be much more open.
Yeah, absolutely. Chad, we did get a taste of how Harris might challenge Donald Trump. He is still ahead in the polls. Harris's speech on Monday, she talked about having been a courtroom prosecutor. I took on perpetrators of all kinds, she said. There was a sort of rustle of laughter as she said that. And this, she also added, hear me when I say I know Donald Trump's type. The question for many European leaders now is whether Kamala Harris can win the presidency.
Yeah, well, she certainly is focusing on the idea that she is a former prosecutor and that she as she moves forward with this campaign, she certainly will talk about the fact that Trump is a convicted felon, and that when she says she knows that type, that's what she's talking about. And that plays, of course, well with her party base. I would just add, by the way, on this idea of the contested convention, I think that a lot of Democrats are still traumatized by the last time they had a contested convention. It was also in Chicago, which is where they're going to have their convention this year. That was in 1968, and that really descended into a mess. Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president at the time, went on to become the nominee, and he lost to Richard Nixon. And I think that that is still something that Democrats are thinking about as they try to move forward here very quickly in nominating Kamala Harris.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, although it's 50, 60 years ago, that it is still
Absolutely
fundamental to the Democrat psyche, perhaps. Ros, in terms, you mentioned the running mate, who Kamala Harris might pick. Most commentators seem to say a white male elected official.
Well, that's right. And we just had a clip of someone talking just before this saying, again, you've got to pick someone who balances you out. You've got to pick someone who has strengths or support in areas that you do not, because the whole point of this is to have a collective of people who can win the ticket on the day. And so there's a lot of talk about officials who are governors of some of these battleground states, particularly Midwest states, which is where she's seen as less strong. And to balance out the fact that she is a woman by perhaps having a male as a vice president candidate. As you say, they all seem to be a group of white males as well, which might raise a few eyebrows, but they are coalescing around some of these governors. Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, Roy Cooper from North Carolina, also the governors of Kentucky, Minnesota, and as discussed previously, Mark Kelly of Arizona is quite intriguing, former astronaut, veteran, someone who does resonate potentially with voters. But what you are seeing is at least 6 to 8, possibly more names in the mix. And that's obviously something that we're going to be looking for her to decide pretty quickly, because, again, the two of them need to be on the road together campaigning very soon.
Chad, most European governments are quietly also cultivating relationships with Republicans. We've mentioned that a number of times. And there have been also new attack lines, it's pretty quick, the back and forth in the US. J.D. Vance talking about Joe Biden, that the Democrats have thrown Joe Biden overboard and that is a threat to democracy. I mean, the language of the two political parties often sort of seems to mirror each other. The Republican election strategy taking shape, do you think?
Yeah, the Republicans had put together a campaign strategy that was to run against Joe Biden. And so they're basically taking that playbook and they're turning it on Kamala Harris. And they're already saying, yesterday, if you think Joe Biden was bad, dear voter, Kamala Harris was there in the room with him every day. She knew that he wasn't well, and she went along with this charade. And if you thought he was bad, Kamala Harris will be even worse. So they've essentially taken the playbook that they had already put together for the campaign, and now they're turning it on Kamala Harris, saying things like immigration. She was the person who was dealing with that in the White House. This is the topic that's very front and center for voters, especially in border states. And so it's very clear that this is going to be the line of attack as we move toward November.
Chad, in that case, how much do we know then what President Harris's foreign policy might be in terms of differences with Biden, or indeed what a Harris White House might look like in terms of differences to Biden?
Well, she didn't have a lot of room to maneuver on foreign policy as vice president. That was an area that Biden really kept for himself. But she has given a few speeches, and it's very clear that she, like Biden, is someone who believes in a foreign policy that embraces the world. It's certainly not the isolationism that Trump or J.D. Vance has talked about. So for many leaders, they obviously knew what they got with President Biden. He was someone who was actively involved in foreign policy for 50 years, but they are likely to get continuity with Kamala Harris. And some of the leaders that we were speaking to in the last day or so were talking as well about Kamala Harris's national security advisor is a man named Philip Gordon, and he's someone who's very well known in European foreign policy circles, someone who has spent time in Europe, and that was something that they see as a positive in terms of someone close to her that obviously understands what's happening in Europe closely.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.